What's up everyone, welcome to the 16th tutorial in our Python language basics. Here we're going to cover some variants of the if statements that we looked at previously. Specifically, we'll be taking a look at consecutive if statements, so one right after the other without necessarily an elif. Then we'll talk about nested if statements, as will be if statements within if statements. And then we'll talk about how to add multiple test cases to a single if statement. This will be done through the use of our logical operators. So we'll kind of go over an example of each and talk about the advantages or disadvantages of using these techniques. Let's head on over to the code now. Alright, so last time we finished off with the basic if, elif, and else statement introduction. Let's go ahead, oops, didn't want to do that. Let's go ahead and get started with a new cell. Okay, we're just going to zoom in there so you guys can see it a little bit clearer, and let's launch into the example we'll use. So I figure we'll use actually a slightly different setup than this, a different example. This is using key presses and moving left or right. What I'm interested in, and you'll see why in a bit, is going to be the kind of health and lives functionality. So very often in video games you'll have a certain number of hit points or health, and you'll also have a certain number of lives. The convention, generally speaking, is to take damage, and that gets subtracted from your hit points. When your hit points reach 0, you lose a life, and if you run out of lives, then you die, and that's kind of game over. Okay, so a very common convention across a lot of games. So for here, we're just going to create some variables to represent those to start off with. They're going to have number of lives equal to 3, and let's say health is equal to 100 or something. You can pick whatever numbers you want, as long as they, of course, make sense. You don't want negative health or negative lives. Okay, so our setup is going to be like this. To start off with, we want to say that we're going to take some damage, okay, and we want to check to see what our levels are because we don't know necessarily what we want to do. Let's say if we're at 0 or less health, then we want to subtract a life, and then later on we'll say that we're actually going to print out another message if we're at 0 lives. Okay, if we're at maybe less than 10% health, then we want to say, okay, we're severely damaged, so be careful. Okay, very often in some video games the screen will flash red or something like that. Okay, and then if you're at less than 50% health, then we'll say, okay, just so you know, 50%, otherwise we're fine. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll assume that we've already taken the damage and we're now testing to see what health is. So the first thing we want to see is, are we dead, essentially, or is our health less than or equal to 0? Okay, so if that's the case, we want to just, for now, just print out a simple message. We're going to say something like, you died. Okay, and I know that's a little bit morbid, but that's the reality of these video games with health and lives. Okay, so we can say elif, health is less than or equal to maybe 10. Okay, we'll say something like, warning, 10% health. Okay, and we're going to say else. I guess we can, we can do the 50% mark. We'll do elif health is less than or equal to 50%. We'll print out a warning. Whoops, this should be like this. Okay, and we're at 50% health. Otherwise, we're not going to bother doing anything. So in this particular instance, there's actually no point having an else because we're not going to do anything. We're not going to print out any kind of a warning, so we'll actually skip that for now. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is see if we're less than or equal to 0. It makes sense. We print this and exit. Otherwise, if we're not less than or equal to 0, let's see if we're less than or equal to 10. Oh, actually, we shouldn't have that percent there. Less than or equal to 10. Okay, if we are less than or equal to 10, then we'll do this. Otherwise, if we're less than or equal to 50, then we'll do that. Okay, so what do you think will happen here? We'll run the cell and nothing should get printed. That makes sense. We're at 100 health. What if we're at 30 health? Okay, warning 50% health. Actually, I should say less than 50% health. Let's do this. Let's do this. And we'll say less than. Okay, that's probably a little bit better there. Okay, what if the health is at 3, for example? Then we're going to say warning less than 10% health, okay, and if we're at like negative, well, let's just say 0, negative health doesn't really make sense, then we'll say you died. Okay, so our logic makes sense. Now, the reason I bring this particular example up is, what if we didn't have the elifs here? What if these were just if statements? Okay, now see what happens when our health is 0. Well, now we get 3 things being printed out. So it doesn't make any sense at all because we died, So obviously our health is less than 10% and also less than 50%. So these are totally redundant. So this is kind of why we introduce the elif rather than just the if statement, because in this particular case, all three tests are technically passing. But because we're calling these elifs rather than ifs, we don't even test these cases as if this one passes. Okay, so that's kind of where we would use if statements versus elif statements. If you do need to perform all of these checks for whatever reason, you needed to perform every single one, then you don't want these in elifs, because if the first one passes, then these two don't even get tested at all. So for that, you'd use ifs. For our example, it just makes more sense to do the elif statement. Okay, cool stuff. So next up, we have the nested if statement. So that's essentially an if statement within an if statement, and you can go many levels deep if you really want. Generally speaking, where possible, I would discourage this, because otherwise you get caught in this kind of nasty, really deep if statement, and it becomes very difficult to debug properly. Okay. However, there are situations where it can't be avoided, and a lot of situations where it makes sense. If you can keep your if statements clean and simple, then that should be totally fine. Okay, so a nested if statement will occur when we test something, but then we want to provide additional tests. So our example here would be the place where we'd want additional tests would be here, because if the health is less than or equal to 0, we need other logic to test. Okay, so in that particular case, what we're going to do is within this if statement, we'll first subtract the number of lives. So we'll say num lives minus equals 1, so fairly straightforward. And then we need to perform another check, because we need to see if the number of lives is equal to 0. If we have no more lives left, then we are basically, we're done the game. Okay, so here we're actually just going to say we're going to subtract 1 from the lives, and I guess actually we'll do this first. No, you know what, actually it makes a bit more sense to do it afterwards. So we'll subtract 1 from the lives, and we'll say something like, instead of you died, maybe this will be something like you lose a life. Okay, but now we need to perform the check. So we need to say if the number of lives is, let's say the number of lives is less than or equal to 0, well, now we need to do something else. So now we need to say, we need to print you died. Okay, so this makes a bit more sense. Technically, we're not dying. Well, within the game, we're not dying if we reach 0 health, as long as we have some lives left. But if we have 0 health and we have no lives, then of course we died. So in this particular case, it actually makes sense to nest our if statements, because we're executing code before we're performing the second check. Okay, if we weren't doing this, okay, we were just doing this and then immediately this check, we could actually combine these into a single test. We could do something like this, and num lives is less than or equal to 0. So this is basically testing both conditions. This is basically doing exactly the same thing as this without these lines of code here. Okay? So if we wanted to make this a little bit more complex, what we could do is maybe we have a certain number of health kits, and maybe our game is really nice and it automatically applies a health kit if we reach 0 health but have some health kits. Okay, so what we could do is we could say number of health kits is equal to, maybe we'll have 3 health kits as well. Okay, so in that particular case, we want to say if health is less than or equal to 0, and the number of health kits is less than or equal to 0, then we want to do something. So then we're going to say number of health kits is less than or equal to 0. Then we'll execute this logic here. Otherwise, if the number of health kits is not equal to 0, then we'll just kind of increase our health. All right, so for that, you can definitely put this logic back in. We can uncomment that, and this should work. We haven't included the logic to kind of heal ourselves back up, but you could definitely put that within this if statement, or you could create another case. So basically say if health is less than or equal to 0 and number of health kits is less than or equal to 0, or you could do and have an this should be here, an elif. Health is less than or equal to 0, and number of health kits is greater than or greater than 0. Okay, and then you could have the logic in there. We're actually going to skip that out. Like I said, this is really just supposed to be a simple example. We're not actually building the game and implementing real logic, but this is kind of something like how a simple game might go. Okay, so we've actually demonstrated 3 things there. The first was why we should use elif versus just if statements in a row when using one is appropriate versus the other. We also talked about nesting if statements. We can see this example here. And we also talked about combining multiple tests in a single if statement with our AND operator. You can do the OR operator, or actually, you know what, Python syntax is actually the AND, like this. Okay, not like this. Almost every other language I've used has done this, but Python likes the AND, okay? And the OR operators, like so. Just remember that OR will pass if at least one of these passes, whereas the AND operator will only pass if both of these pass, okay? So what I would recommend you do is play around with this a bit. Maybe if you want, try to kind of finish off this logic, add in the kind of health kit logic. So if we have some health kits left that we want to heal back up, maybe change our the health back up to 100 or something like that. Play around with it. Once you are comfortable with this, then we can move on to the next topic where we'll be starting our loops discussion. Okay, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.